What's going on, everybody? My name is Matt, and welcome to part 3 of this JavaScript tutorial where we're going to talk about variables. Now, a variable is a container that stores some type of value. As simple as it gets. It stores it within your computer's RAM or whoever's using its RAM, and it allows them to be used at a later time without you having to type out those values over and over and over again. You can just simply use the name of the variable or change the value of the variable later. They're just really helpful to use, and you're going to see variables used going forward after we talk about them today. They're just really helpful. The way that you write a variable is this is just one way, but you can type the word var, and then we're going to say num to represent the word number. It doesn't really matter what you name it, but we're just going to say num equals 6. Now, there are a few different things that are happening here. You have this var, which is the type of variable that we're declaring, and we're going to talk about the other types here in a minute. This is the name of your variable, so the thing that you're going to call back later on. This is your assignment operator to say, I want to make sure that there is a value associated with this variable name. And then you have the value itself followed by the semicolon to close the line. And the way that you would log this, normally we would say console.log and we would type in a string that has some kind of value, or we would just type a number. In this case, you're only going to type in the name of the variable. And then if you were to run your code, you're going to get the value 6 because it's logging the value associated with that variable name. Now, it's also important to note that there are different conventions and rules when it comes to variable names. First, I'm going to start with the rules, and then we'll talk about the conventions. The rules are things that have to be followed. The conventions are things that are optional but highly recommended. So let's start with the rules. You can't have a special character of any kind in your variable name, so I couldn't put like an ampersand or a percent sign or anything like that. But I can use an underscore. That is the only thing that would be considered a valid character to use. I didn't mean to put a dash, by the way. It's an underscore. It's the only special character that is valid and usable whenever you're declaring a variable. You can't have spaces. So if I have multiple words, I can't put a space after, in this case, the word num or before the word num. And then you can't start your variable with a number. It will not work that way. So no numbers, no special characters unless you're using underscore, and then no spaces. There are also conventions. These are things that are highly recommended that you follow because everybody using Java, well, not everybody, most people using JavaScript are following these conventions, though it will not break your code if you don't follow these conventions. One convention is to use a descriptive variable name. So num is perfectly acceptable because that makes sense what you're trying to do. But what you don't want to do is like the letter N. Now, there are some instances where you might use a one-letter thing. Like, for example, when we talk about loops, we're going to be using just the variable name I. But that's because for loops, that's the convention. And we're going to talk about that way later on. But there are conventions that you follow, and one of the conventions is that typically when you're declaring variables, you want to have a descriptive name, but not too descriptive where you have like 4 or 5 words bundled together into one word. That's just too much. Another convention is to use camel casing. So let's just say I wanted to call this num value. The first letter would stay lowercase, and then for any new word, we would uppercase the first letter. So we would say num value as opposed to using something like a space, which won't even work. And then in other languages, like for example Python, it would be num underscore value, which will work just fine in JavaScript, but it's the convention for Python. So it's just recommended that you use the camel casing like you see here. And that's what I'm going to follow going forward. For every variable that I've named that has multiple names, I'm going to use camel casing. So I highly recommend that you get in the habit of that when you're working with JavaScript, because that makes it where others can follow along as to what's going on. And also it just makes it to where you're able to be a part of the community of people using JavaScript following those conventions. Nobody wants to go to a code a code set or a project and look at JavaScript code that's written under another language's convention, because then it can get really confusing. So I don't recommend that you do that. Though obviously I can't require you to do so. It won't break your code, but it's something that's just a good habit to build. Now, it's also important to know that variable names are case sensitive. So if I wanted to have another variable and name it, for some reason I wanted to also name it num, if I were to do a capital num and make that equal to 12, well, this would be perfectly acceptable in JavaScript's eyes whenever you're running your code, because it is saying, okay, you have a completely new and unrelated variable name because it has a different casing. Which, a lot of that's happening under the hood, the way that, binary and stuff works with uppercase and lowercase whenever all of your code is compiled and stuff. There's a reason why all of that's happening, but you should know that if you change the casing on your variable name, it is the equivalent of just changing the name entirely. So that's just really important to know, because if you were to later on, let's just say I wanted to change the value of this variable later on, if I were to use different casing, it would still technically work. But if I were to have another variable that had the uppercase first letter, and then later on you see that I changed the value, attempting to change it for here, but I had it with an uppercase letter, then you're going to get some unexpected behavior. So it's just important to know that it's when you have different casing, then it's as if you're making a totally new variable altogether. Now, let's say that I wanted to change the value of this variable. The way that I would do that is I wouldn't have to use var again. I would just simply use the variable name and say num equals 13. And now, whenever I run this program, we're going to get 13 because it's saying initially this number is 6, now it's 13. And you know what? To even see this behavior, I'll do another console.log and say num, and that way you can see that it's going to show what it was before and then show what it was after. So let's go ahead and run the code, and we're going to see initially it was 6 and then it changed to 13. All right. Now I want to talk about, this is something else to note actually before I move on to the different types of variables. If you can actually declare new variables using the names of your other variables. So let's say I wanted to have another number, num2, and this is going to be equal to num plus 2. So this is saying whatever the value is that num is, even if it changes later on, no matter what num is, I want num2 to be the equivalent of that number plus 2. So in this case, whenever I log num2, I'm going to get the value 8 because it's saying this value plus this value is now equal to this variable. And if I were to change later on, num2 equals 9, this isn't going to affect this in any way. This is just simply saying I'm wanting to change the value just for this variable here. So whenever I log this now, we're just going to get 9. And if I were to log the first number again, then we're going to get the same one we got earlier, which is 6. Okay? So it's, these are not necessarily tied together. Even if I were to go down here and change num to 9, and I were to log num2, all it's going to do is say, in this case, it's actually going to be 6 plus 2 still, because the change happens after the variable is declared. So let me go ahead and move this below here. And then we're going to see that it turns into 11. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I think it might actually work either way, because it's still changing the value, and then it's running that callback to num2 after that num changed to 9. No, that's what I thought. Okay, if the new declaration happens after you have declared your initial variable, then it's not going to change it for this value. That's exactly what I thought was going to happen. I just wanted to make sure I was right on that. So typically, if you want to go with the current value, you want to make sure that this num2 declaration is underneath when the num changes to the new number. Then when you run it, you're going to get 11. Okay, now, after all that's been said, I hope you're not too confused yet. We're going to move on to one more thing regarding variables, and then we're going to call it quits, and then you can start playing around with this. I know I've given you guys a lot of information on variables, but it's crucial information, and we're going to get a lot more practice as we continue on. But let's talk about the different kinds of variables. So as I mentioned before, we had var num equals 6. Another way to write this would be the word let num equal 6. Var and let both are the types of variables where the variable can change later on. So if I ever wanted to change num, like I did earlier, to num equals 8, then that's totally valid because we're saying for now, this number is going to be equal to 6, but it is subject to change later on should I decide to do so. The difference between let and var, however, is in what's known as the scoping. So let is block scoped, whereas var is function scoped. We're not going to talk about what that really means right now. It is not a huge deal to think about right now with what we're talking about. But once we start talking about functions and scoping and things like that, we'll talk about it. For now, just see let and var as having the same type of behavior because we're not even working with functions and blocks of code yet anyway. So let is the one that's most common anyway because block scoping is, in my opinion, better. But just note that let and var allow you to change this value later on. Now let's just say I didn't want to change this value later on. That's perfectly okay. You can use what is known as a const variable, which represents a constant variable, to say no matter what, I never want to change num to anything other than 6. Well, if I were to go down here and say num equals 8 again, whenever I run my code, we're going to get an error, and it's going to say assignment to a constant variable. I'm trying to assign a new value to the variable that's already set to a constant value. So this is actually really applicable when you're talking about, let's just say you have like a credit card number, and you don't want that to change later on. Like the user, like they'll input their credit card, and you're wanting to process that credit card. Well, if you accidentally have another variable with the same name and you give it a different value, if it's not set to constant but set to let and var, it's going to change that, and then you're going to run into a whole lot of problems. Whereas if you have it set to constant, it's just going to give you this error and say, before you move on, you need to fix this because we're not going to run your code with you having this in your line, in line 3, for example. We're not going to run this. Also, just while this is up here, this is the first time that I've showed you guys this. Whenever you run into an error, the thing that you want to look at first is like you want to see where it's happened. I'm going on a rabbit trail, I know, just follow along for a second. It's going to tell you the name of the file, it's going to tell you what line in that file, and then it's going to point to the problem, and then give you the error here. If you ever don't understand the error, honestly, you can just copy and paste it into ChatGPT, and it'll explain what's going on to you. But just wanted to make that known. Anyway, so those are the different kinds of variables that we're going to use. They are very important that you make sure that if you want a constant, you use const. If you want a one that can be changed later on, then you want to use var or let. For the majority of what we're going to be talking about in this series, I'm going to be using let instead of var. And again, I'm going to explain why that is later on. But it's not important to understand those right now. Anyways, all that said, I know we covered a whole lot here with variables, a whole lot of different use cases, and how things can be broken and how these work. This is a great place to stop and to allow you to go through and just play around with this because you can assign a variable anything. You can assign it a string. You can assign it a boolean. You can assign it undefined. You can assign it null. You can assign this variable anything that you want. You can even assign it a math problem, and then the result will be logged under that variable. I mean, you can do a whole lot with variables, and I'm purposefully not going through all of those here because it would take too long, and so that you can have a chance to go through and try things out, let things break a little bit, run into a bunch of errors, and then really learn how to use variables. But that being said, that's going to be it for this part here. Next, we're going to be talking about type conversions, which is pretty exciting because there's a whole lot of stuff to talk about there. But we're moving little step by little step. I hope I'm not talking too fast. I hope I'm not going too fast. I hope you guys are able to follow along. But if you have questions, put them in the comment section and I'll try to get to them as quickly as I can. If you need to rewatch the video, go ahead and rewatch it. But for now, that's going to be it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. See ya.